pipe tobacco. The girl whose father was a wonderful guy, just being in the presence of pipe tobacco will make her feel safe and loved. And the other one, just the smell of pipe tobacco can trigger an all-out panic attack. Pipe tobacco has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with abuse or with love. The subconscious does not care, because it isn't logical, it's associative. And it's also visual, and the big problem with that is that no and not are purely logical concepts, which means your subconscious does not pick them up at all. So let me give you an example. I'm going to say something in just a second, and I want you to be noticing what picture comes into your head. Okay? I am not going to fall out of this chair. Now, what did you just see in your head?
You fall out of the chair.
You saw me falling out of the chair, didn't you? Right?
Yes.
Okay? There's a famous sort of trick that you play on people. I'm going to count to 5, and then I want everybody for 5 seconds to not think about pink elephants.
The kids love to play this game.
Oh yeah, it's great fun for kids.
Yeah.
So this is actually easy to do. How do you do it? How do you not think about pink elephants?
It's impossible.
No, it's trivially easy. How do you do it?
You think of something else.
You pick something else. You say, I will think of hippopotamuses delicately dancing ballet on their toes wearing tutus. And then I count to 5 and you imagine dancing hippopotamuses, and after 5 seconds you have not thought of pink elephants. But if you sit and try to not think of pink elephants, your mind will be full of pink elephants. Okay? This actually has really significant consequences, and so I learned this through athletics. So I'm not an athlete anymore. In high school, I was an academic all-state basketball player, and I was pretty good. And one thing I was exceptionally good at is shooting free throws. So I once made 102 free throws in a row in practice. I would shoot sets of 10, and I pretty much expected to always make at least 8. But my freshman year, so when I was a kid in high school, we did 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. So 9th grade was a separate team. So in 9th grade, we lost at least one game from me missing free throws. I shot close to 90% in practice, but not anywhere close to that in games. From 10th grade through 12th grade, I started all 3 years on the varsity, and I was the guy who shot all the technicals. And my senior year in high school, my final stat sheet for the year, I was more than 90% on free throws, which is better than all but about 5 NBA players last year. Now, in practice, I wasn't any better as a senior than I was as a freshman. But when I remember one game in particular where I got fouled. We were a point behind, and I got fouled with just a few seconds left, and I honked both free throws. And I was sitting there saying, please God, don't let me miss this shot. So what was I imagining happening? I was imagining that shot clanking, which is exactly what happened. So I read about this principle over the summer between my freshman and sophomore years, and it was talking about the biggest difference between the athletes who consistently come through under pressure and the ones who don't, and it comes down to the ones who consistently choke say, don't miss this shot, and the ones who consistently come through say, give me the ball so I can make this shot. They are logically the same thing, but they are not visually the same thing. And I'm going to give you an example from politics, and I'm going to preface it by saying I'm not trying to get an argument started about Donald Trump. And in particular, when at the end of this, I finish explaining the technique that Donald Trump used, and immediately after that I say Satan uses the same technique on us, I am not saying that Donald Trump is Satan. Just to make sure we're clear on that. But this particular example illustrates it so well I couldn't resist. Richard Nixon, the news media absolutely hated that man, and he hated them right back. Which should sound familiar, because the news media absolutely hates Donald Trump, and he hates them right back. The difference is that Donald Trump is very much smarter than Richard Nixon, and in particular, he understands people very much better. It's good to understand people. It is also good to use that knowledge responsibly. But there was, I don't know if you guys remember this, but about a year ago, there was a big push to try to have Donald Trump removed from office on the grounds that he was insane. There were a couple of psychologists who went on television and said they had diagnosed him and he was, mentally ill. So this ran for about a week with Trump's enemies talking about he was this mentally unstable moron. And then Trump produced, the only thing he ever really said about it, he produced 3 tweets, one tweet that was 3 tweets long because of the character limits. And this was the tweet where he called himself a very stable genius. Right? And it was a stupid looking tweet. He said, one of my great strengths is that I'm very smart. Which made him sound like a valley girl. Right? He capitalized TV star inappropriately, and very stable genius. We've gotten used to the phrase over the last year, but that was actually a really weird sounding phrase. And one of the congressional Democratic congressmen said, Donald Trump saying, I am a very stable genius is just like Richard Nixon saying, I am not a crook. What I hope you can see is that it's the exact opposite. When Richard Nixon gave this speech, he actually solidified in the minds of America the association of Richard Nixon. When he said, I am not a crook, everybody listening imagined him with a little burger mask and the stripes. And to this day, what most people think of, if they think of Richard Nixon, is he's the crooked president. Right? Trump said this, I am a very stable genius, and the tweet sounded stupid, and his political opponents spent the next 2 weeks making fun of him for calling himself a very stable genius, and talking about how stupid he was to think that he could be a very stable genius. And for 2 weeks, they completely stopped saying Donald Trump is a mentally unstable moron, and spent 2 weeks saying Donald Trump is not a very stable genius. By the time they were done, nobody in America who paid any attention at all to politics could hear the words very stable genius and not instantly think of Donald Trump. He did 3 tweets, and then he just didn't talk about it anymore. I would say he completely destroyed the narrative, but he didn't completely destroy the narrative. He got his opponents to destroy their own narrative. Right? And in fact, the people who were being like Richard Nixon saying, I am not a crook, were Donald Trump's opponents who ran around for 2 weeks saying Donald Trump is not a very stable genius. And I have to tell you, my favorite example of all of that, there was a CNN reporter who thinks he is very smart and Donald Trump is very stupid, who wrote, he didn't just write an article, the headline was, Donald Trump thinking he is a very stable genius proves that he isn't. So he puts Donald Trump and very stable genius in the headline. Then there was actually a point in the article where he said, if Donald Trump were actually a genius, he wouldn't be talking about mental illness because that doesn't favor him. He would be talking about the economy. And then he listed like 4 things that Donald Trump ought to be bragging about in an attempt to prove that Donald Trump is stupid. And the thing is, do you know how many people read that article?
I never.
How many people saw the headline compared to how many people read the article?
Not more.
And what does the headline say? Donald Trump, very stable genius. Okay? And this is where I say, without saying that Donald Trump is Satan, that Satan uses this on us all the time, because Satan knows just as much about how we work as Donald Trump does. And the thing of it is, this principle can be used for good just as much as it can be used for bad. This is just the way God made us. So the important thing is to understand that this is what really shapes our minds, not the logical stuff that goes in our heads, right? You can look at this and think, boy, the people who can't tell the difference between I am a stable genius and I am not a stable genius are kind of stupid. But look, this is how we work. This is how people function, right? You may be familiar with actual cases of this. People who work with the abused. We'll see this over and over. If you're talking to a 14-year-old boy whose father has been abusive, and that boy says, I will never grow up to be like my father. I will never treat my wife the way my dad treats my mom. I will never treat my children the way my dad treats me. Anybody who works with these people would put good money on saying that if you come back and look at this guy when he's 30, he will be just like his father. Okay? Because the subconscious is not only visual and not logical, but it is wired to conform. The subconscious shapes us to be what it sees. So, the Bible is very much aware of this because God knows how we work just as well as Donald Trump does, right? He who walks with wise men becomes wise. Notice, not he who sits in a class listening to wise men becomes wise, right? He who walks with wise men, he who spends time with wise men becomes wise. Do not be conceived. Do not be conceived.
Deceived.
Do not be conceived. That is a hard one to obey. That's a hard command to obey. I'll get right on that. Do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals. So my dad, do you know the funny thing is, I say that my dad was really good at finding ways to say things to where I would remember them. I've come to realize, because of having kids of my own, I think actually probably my dad just said things over and over and over again, and then sooner or later, by accident, he would hit a way to say it that I would remember it. And this particular story, my dad actually heard me telling this, and he has no memory of this at all. But he told me once, he said, look, Kenny, you need to make up your mind what kind of person you want to be. Then go find people who are like that and spend as much time with them as you can. Because if you spend time with honest people, you will become more honest. If you spend time around liars, whether you mean to or not, you will find that you start telling lies. If you spend time around people with a good sense of humor, you will get funnier. If you spend time around happy people, you'll get happier. And if you spend time around rich people, you'll go broke from picking up the But this is true. This is absolutely true. If that kid does not want to be like his father, then he does not need to sit around saying, I'm not going to be like my father. He needs to go find some man who treats his wife the way the kid wants to treat his wife and go spend as much time with that guy. He wants to say, I will treat my wife the way he treats his wife. I will treat my children the way this guy treats his children. Not, I will not treat my wife like my father. Because you're filling your mind with images of you behaving the way your father does. Right? And that's pretty much God, the way God made us, and He did it on purpose. And it is why children who grow up in a house, Jesus told the Israelites, write my words on the beams of your house. Surround your children with my word, so that they will grow up with my word being built into them. Right? Your heart does not follow your brain. It follows your eyes. And there are very few things that are more important for you to understand than this when it comes to being successful in making real change. It's a terribly difficult thing for teenagers to understand, and you hear it over and over from teenagers who are listening to inappropriate music, or what, right? Like, well, I just like the music, and I don't pay any attention to the words. That could not be more wrong, right? Whatever you are filling yourself with is changing you. Little by little where you can't see it, but you never see a kid grow till you measure him and he's grown. Right?
I have a question about this. I actually asked the youth minister in our church once. It's because right now in Asian, the second generation, they tend to like Korean music, Korean K-pop.
K-pop.
And they don't understand what they sing, but they love it. They hear it. They love, you know.
They dance very well.
Yeah. And you talk about.
Dance for him.
Yeah, something like that.
No, monkey.
So you.
It's the only Korean dance I know.
Because you talk about if the kids learn some the bad words in the music, they will have a bad impact. But that music worries me because the music itself sounds okay. It's like pop music, but the words they don't understand. I don't understand.
No bad words there.
Yeah, no bad words. But is this a good impact, a bad impact, or no impact?
That's a very good question. I hadn't thought about it. Just totally off the cuff, totally off the top of my head.
Yeah. Okay.
So this answer is worth what you're paying for it. I wouldn't worry too much about words they don't understand. What worries me is the kids who understand the words perfectly well and tell themselves, I just don't listen.
I think if they don't
That's-
understand, it's better than listening to those
Bad
bad songs. Oh, but one thing that, because Kai showed me that Korean thing too.
Yeah.
Their dancing is okay, but lots of those young kids, Korean kids, they are boys. But then
The dress
they
like
they make
dress
up like
like
girls. They do look like girls.
Yeah,
They're
see,
like
that-
not manly.
That's
that's a culture.
It's another thing.
And they.
it
how
is
could
not
they-
wise for them to be watching it. It just isn't. It is a very difficult thing to get American teenagers, again, I don't know about other cultures, but it's a very difficult thing to get American children to understand this. And one of the reasons is it gets in the way of them doing stuff they want to do, right? Because you want to be able to tell yourself, this isn't going to hurt me, right? So it's, and all of us are good at rationalizing what we want to do, but teenagers are especially good at it. So it's a very hard thing to get across to teenagers, but it's a pretty critical thing.
So can you give kids a lesson in the future?
Yes. Like
Telling them not to listen to the
We talked about this just a little bit, but I did not tell them that they couldn't listen to hip-hop music with bad language in it. I suppose we could at some point.
deeper.
yeah.
This verse, most people know, but I think that we tend to sort of misunderstand this renewal of the mind. Right? Because it mentions the mind, what we think of when we think of renewing the mind is we think of like Bible study and we think more of teaching. But the Bible, when it's talking about the renewing of the mind, it's talking about something that takes a lot longer. And this is one of my favorite verses. I think it's one of the really more important verses of Scripture. This is Paul pretty much saying, look, fill your mind with the things of God. Fill your mind with the good things. Because what you fill your mind with, your subconscious is going to assume that's what you're supposed to do. This is the thing. Whatever you fill your mind with, you're giving instructions to your subconscious. Whether you mean to or not, your subconscious takes that as this is where I'm supposed to go. The Psalm 1, I'm sorry. You can have the presentation when we're done. Psalm 1 gets both parts of it, right? Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. So number one, do not fill your mind with the bad influences. And while it's at it, Psalm 1 is perfectly well aware of the fact that you will conform. That if you start off walking with the wicked, you'll wind up standing with the sinners, and eventually you'll be sitting with the scoffers. Right? So it understands both that you do not want to be filling your mind with the bad influences, but instead you do what, in other words, this is a not, right? Do not do this, do not do that. But it doesn't stop with the not. It says, here's what you do. His delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. And the result, everything he does prospers. Right? At least with Western evangelicalism, we place a whole lot of emphasis on Bible study, and Bible study is important, but you have to understand that Bible study only gets it into your brain. It only gets it into your head, which it doesn't accomplish much there. Really, what Bible study is really good at is Bible study by itself is really good at getting you into Romans 7, where you know what you're supposed to do. It's not very good at getting you to Romans 8, where you're actually doing it. Right? And Bible study, so again, this is more of an American problem, I think, because Americans are so totally into instant gratification. And Bible study gives you something very close to instant gratification. You can figure out what the passage means usually pretty quickly. You can arrive at understanding very quickly. And so it's very, very satisfying. Cool, I have learned something. If 1 Corinthians 6:18, this is Paul ending a long section about the importance of sexual purity. So he says, so glorify God in your body. How long does it take for you to understand what Paul means when he's saying glorify God in your body? I mean, it's essentially obvious as soon as you read it, right? It doesn't take long at all. How long does it take for your ordinary 18-year-old boy to desire sexual purity? That is not something that happens in the amount of time that it takes to understand that the Bible commands us to be sexually pure. Right? It takes a long time for the heart to change. And the image I sort of keep in my mind is that that our brain is like a little PT boat or like a jet ski, right? You can turn on a dime. And our heart is more like the Queen Mary. It takes a while to get that thing to turn. So the primary Bible study lets us know what it is that we need to build into our hearts, but it doesn't build into our hearts. So we can talk about these later if you want what these are. I'm listing these more as example. These are the two primary spiritual disciplines that Christians have used to build the truths into their hearts. This is why your pastors, I'm guessing, probably encourage you to memorize Scripture and not just read it. This is not the only way to do it, and I'm going to use my wife as an example because I don't think I know that my wife does not like liturgy, and I don't think she does much meditation, but she has grown immensely spiritually over the last few years, and I'll tell you what a big part of that
How do
is.
you know I don't do meditation?
I said I don't think. I said I don't think.
Okay.
Do you know what it is that builds stuff into her heart? I'm going to tell her here. Think about, I don't know, do you guys have any idea what it takes for Helen to produce one of those podcasts that she does?
How long?
Yeah. So let me tell you what it looks like when Helen does a podcast. So God shows Helen something that strikes her and she says, oh, this is cool, this is important. Then she writes an article. Right? This usually takes an hour, 2 hours. She rewrites it several times. She thinks about how to say it best. Then she reads it. So she's already typed it. Now she reads it. She reads it into the computer. She goes and she chooses the music. So she thinks about it and she figures out what music is going to go well with this thing that she's trying to express. She mixes the music in. Having recorded it, she goes back over and she listens to the whole thing over and over to hear whether she made any mistake that she didn't notice when she was making it, or whether, the neighbor's dog barked or something and she didn't notice. Everything that's not perfect, she re-records that bit. Then she mixes it all back together. By the time she's done, she'll spend anywhere from 8 to maybe 20 hours living that insight from God, tasting it with her mouth, hearing it with her ears, putting it to music, writing it, right? So by the time she's done with a podcast, she has been dwelling on whatever it is that God has taught her, right? Which is exactly what other people use meditation for, or liturgy, or whatever. So I'm not telling you that you have to start meditating or that you have to start doing liturgy. What I am telling you is, if you're going to get God's truths into your heart, where they affect the daily behavior, you are going to have to find some way to hold those things in front of your eyes for a long time, to dwell on them. Because understanding can happen instantly, but reprogramming your heart takes time. This, I think, is the key. I have hidden your word in my heart so that I might not sin against you. It has got to get out of your head. But it doesn't have to get out of your head. It can stay in your head, but it has to get to your heart. Because until it gets to your heart, nothing really changes. Which is a long way back to solution and blame mode. But until you understand that, until you understand this principle, you don't understand, I think, how catastrophic it is that the blame person obsesses on the failure. that the blame person is filling his mind with the failure. So we're going to see, and I don't know how long we've already been, but we'll get however far we get. But what you'll see is that people in solution mode, everybody fails, right? Everybody fails every now and then. People in solution mode deal with their failure much more effectively. That is certainly true. But what is at least as important is that people who deal with their failures in solution mode don't fail nearly as often as people who are in blame mode, because the people who live in blame mode reinforce their failure. They train themselves to fail some more. And when you see somebody who's 50 years old and they've lived all their lives in blame mode, if you know them well, what you know is they make the same mistakes over and over and over and over. Every relationship looks like the last relationship.
I have a question. So we can observe that people are naturally divided into who are used to more in solution mode versus or in blame mode. But my question is, I mean, are they by genetic, or are they by, did they just grow up from family?
I'm glad you asked that, because that slide's far enough at the end I wasn't going to get to it. So I'm glad you asked it, because it's apparently important. I think it's very much like a bad temper. Okay? In that there is a genetic component. I think there are certainly people who are born to where they just naturally spend time in blame mode. Some of my children, and the reason I'm sure there's a genetic component is because I can see in my kids that some of them are much more prone to blame mode than others. And it's not like, you know, they were raised differently. Sally's in blame mode all the time.
All the time.
Mostly to you.
So, Helen, I have to tell you that Helen says the reason that I think solution mode and blame mode is so important, and I work so hard to convince our family to stay in solution mode, is that it's pure self-defense. Because I do so many things wrong, that it's really important for my family to stay in solution mode, because otherwise I'm getting blamed all the time. But there are also absolutely blame cultures. There are families that have a culture of blame. So you can be trained because you grow up imitating the people you're around, right? So you can absolutely grow up being trained to deal with problems in blame mode. And you know, I want to make one thing really clear. So if there probably are people here that are already starting to suspect that the end point of this is going to be that they are going to need to admit to themselves, at least, that they spend most of their time in blame mode.